Greetings, this is Reverend Yue McCormick of True Vow Temple. In this presentation, the second of 8 parts, I will be talking about the opening section of the Nyorai Juryo-hon, or Duration of the Life of the Tathagata Chapter, which is recited in the morning and evening devotional practice and other services of Nichiren Buddhism. In this section are the 4 admonitions of the Buddha to understand by faith and listen attentively, and the 4 requests of Maitreya Bodhisattva to hear the Dharma. In this video, the portion of the Juryo-hon that we will examine begins with Niji Butsu go shobo satsugyu saidai shu shozen nan shi nyoto to shinge nyorai jotai shigo bugo dai shu nyoto to shinge nyorai jotai shigo ubugo shodai shu nyoto to shinge nyorai jotai shigo. At that time, the Buddha said to all the bodhisattvas and the whole great assembly, "All you good men, you should understand by faith the sincere truth of the Tathagata's words." Again he said to the great assembly, "You should understand by faith the sincere truth of the Tathagata's words." Once again he said to the great assembly, "You should understand by faith the sincere truth of the Tathagata's words." Starting in the middle of chapter 15, when Shakyamuni Buddha first responds to Maitreya Bodhisattva's questions about the appearance of the bodhisattvas who sprang up from underground, and continuing on through this chapter until the end of chapter 22, is the portion of the Lotus Sutra known as the expanded opening of the near to reveal the distant, in which the Buddha fully explains that the near, his current life of 80 years, needs to be opened up or seen to actually be a local and timely manifestation of the distant, his attainment to Buddhahood in the remotest past, and ongoing care for deluded beings. As chapter 16 opens, the Buddha admonishes or urgently urges the assembly 3 times to understand by faith the sincere truth of his words. A phrase found here I'd like to draw attention to is shozen nan shi, which means, "All you good men." The Buddha says this frequently in the sutras to make sure that he has the attention of those he is addressing. In other places, he will address particular people by calling out their names, as he does with Shariputra in chapter 2. The compound Zen Nan Shi has been translated variously as good men, or good children, or good sons, and could even be translated as gentlemen. The character Zen means good or wholesome, while the character Nan specifically means a man or male person, while Shi can mean child or descendant. The 3 characters therefore are referring to a male descendant of a good family, or in short, to the assembled gentlemen. Despite the fact that the Buddha seems to be primarily addressing a male monastic assembly, the wonderful Dharma that is being taught is shown to be inclusive of males and females, monastics and householders, and even human and non-human beings. Another important term that appears in this passage is shinge. Shinge is a translation of the Sanskrit word adimukti, which can be translated into English as understanding by faith. It can also be translated as determination, resolution, or zeal. It can be understood as an unshakable confidence in the Dharma that leads to a fuller and fuller understanding, culminating in Buddhahood. The term shinge, or understanding by faith, appears throughout the Lotus Sutra. For example, it is the title of the 4th chapter, in which it refers to understanding the teaching of the one vehicle by faith. More importantly, in chapter 17, the Buddha tells Maitreya Bodhisattva that anyone who hears that my life is so long and understands it by faith, even at a single moment's thought, will be able to obtain innumerable merits. The Buddha goes on to say that the innumerable merits of having a single moment of understanding by faith is 100, 1,000, 10,000, and 100 million times greater than that of practicing the first 5 of the 6 perfections, which are generosity, morality, patience, energy, and meditative absorption. In other words, even a single thought moment of understanding by faith will bring one to the brink of Buddhahood. Finally, there is the term jotai, or sincere truth. Why doesn't the Buddha simply say, "You should understand by faith the truth of the Tathagata's words"? According to Nyorai Juryo-hon, in his commentary Words and Phrases of the Lotus Sutra, in the past, 7 stages of skillful means were given as teachings according to the minds of others, but these were not the sincere truth. Now the Buddha is giving the teaching according to one's own mind to show the essence. Therefore, it is called the sincere truth. Because the bodhisattvas have received the sincere truth, they do not dare to doubt it. In other words, in the past, Buddha taught people according to what they were ready to hear and understand. But now the Buddha is going to speak directly about his own understanding. That is why these words are not simply the truth, but the sincere truth of the Tathagata. The next portion is Zeiji bo satsu dai shu mi roku I shu ga sho byaku butsu gan sei san wi gan sei shi ga to shin ju butsu go nyo zei san byaku I bu gan wi gan sei shi ga to shin ju butsu go. Then the bodhisattvas and great assembly, headed by Maitreya, joined their hands together and said to the Buddha, "World-honored one, please explain, for we will faithfully receive the Buddha's words." They said this 3 times, and again said, "Please explain, for we will faithfully receive the Buddha's words." In this passage, the great assembly led by Maitreya Bodhisattva makes 4 requests to hear the Dharma in response to the Buddha's 3 admonitions. In Japanese, roku is a pronunciation of the Chinese characters used to transliterate the name Maitreya, whose name means the loving one. In some passages, the Buddha addresses him as Ajita, or the invincible one. Maitreya is a bodhisattva who is said to be the next Buddha in the future, long after the disappearance of the dispensation of Shakyamuni Buddha, the current Buddha of this world. It is believed that he resides in the heaven of Tushita for 576 million years, before being reborn in this world to save those who had not been saved by Shakyamuni Buddha. Maitreya Bodhisattva appears among the 80,000 bodhisattvas present in the former assembly on Mount Sacred Eagle in the first introductory chapter of the Lotus Sutra. In chapter 15, the appearance of bodhisattvas from underground, he inquires as to the origin of the bodhisattvas appearing from underground. He also asks how Shakyamuni Buddha could be the teacher of these primordial bodhisattvas, when his attainment of awakening for the first time was little more than 40 years ago. This second question is what the Buddha is responding to when he says at the start of this chapter, "You should understand by faith the sincere truth of the Tathagata's words," to which Maitreya Bodhisattva declares 3 times as head of the Great Assembly that they will faithfully receive the Buddha's answer. In chapters 17 and 18, the Buddha will continue to address Maitreya Bodhisattva when explaining the boundless merits of those who accept the teaching of the Buddha's unborn and deathless nature with faith. Another term that appears in this passage would be good to know is gasho. Gasho refers to the joining together of the palms of the hands, which can be a sign of respectful greeting, or, as here, a gesture of reverence and acceptance. Finally, there is the title for the Buddha, Seisan, which is the Japanese pronunciation of the Chinese characters used to translate the title Lokanatha, or Bhagavat. The term Bhagavat can also be translated into English as Blessed One or Lord. As covered in the first video on the Juryo-hon, it is one of the 10 honorable titles of a Buddha. The next portion is Niji se san chi shobo satsu san sho fu shi ni go shi gan yo to tai cho. At that time, the world-honored one, knowing that the bodhisattvas would not cease even after 3 requests, said to them, "You should listen attentively." Here the Buddha responds positively to Maitreya and the assembly's 4 requests and utters a 4th admonition when he says, "You should listen attentively." Why does the Buddha say 3 times that you should understand by faith the sincere truth of the Tathagata's words? And why does Maitreya have to respond 3 times, saying, "Please explain, for we will faithfully receive the Buddha's words," before the Buddha continues to respond to Maitreya's question as to how he was able to teach the ancient bodhisattvas who sprang up from underground in the short amount of time that he had been teaching in the world? We might recall that in Chapter 2, Skillful Means, the Buddha says, "Enough, Shariputra, there is no need to say more." Why is this? Because the Buddhas have fully attained the Dharma that is foremost, rare, and difficult to understand. Only a Buddha together with a Buddha can exhaust the true reality of all things. Shariputra then asks him 3 times to continue to expound the Dharma. The Buddha then says, "You asked me 3 times with enthusiasm. How can I leave the Dharma unexpounded? Listen to me attentively and think over my words. Now I will expound the Dharma to you." It was then that the Buddha taught the One Buddha Vehicle, which is the main theme of the Trace Gate, or the first half of the Lotus Sutra. Now, having made sure that the Great Assembly is truly ready and sincerely willing to hear the Dharma, which the Buddha has not yet proclaimed, he will reveal the true duration of his lifespan as a Tathagata, which is the heart of the original gate, or the latter half of the Lotus Sutra. Notice that the teaching of the one vehicle of the Trace Gate is preceded by the earnest questioning of Shariputra, who will learn that, contrary to what he expected, he will be able to attain Buddhahood. Now, the teaching of the unborn and deathless nature of the Buddha is being preceded by the earnest questioning of Maitreya Bodhisattva, who believes that his attainment of Buddhahood lies in the far future, after the death of the present Shakyamuni Buddha. In other words, Shariputra's preconceptions about who can or cannot attain Buddhahood were broken through in Chapter 2, when the Buddha taught the one vehicle after Shariputra repeatedly requested the Buddha's teaching. Now, Maitreya's preconceptions about the beginning and ending of Buddhahood are going to be broken through as the Buddha responds to his repeated requests to hear the Buddha's response to his question about how the Buddha could have taught the bodhisattvas appearing from underground. The challenging nature of these teachings is why the Buddha requires repeated requests for them. He is not going to impose them upon those who are not ready or willing to hear them, because they are satisfied with what they have already learned or think that they know. The repetitions make it clear that those requesting these teachings are willing to hear them and able to receive them with a sincere receptivity and confidence in the Buddha. Maitreya's preconceptions about Buddhahood are also pointed out by the wise layman Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra. Vimalakirti had asked Maitreya, who was only one rebirth away from attaining Buddhahood, in which rebirth he would attain Buddhahood. This was especially difficult for Maitreya to answer, since he knew that advanced bodhisattvas such as himself were aware that all things are unborn, which is to say, empty. So how could he talk about a rebirth in the future? Vimalakirti also asked him how Maitreya could conceive of himself as attaining Buddhahood, unless all other sentient beings likewise attain Buddhahood, since there is ultimately no separation or difference between all things. These and many other perplexities were raised by Vimalakirti, and Maitreya was utterly confounded by them. Now, in Chapter 16 of the Lotus Sutra, in response to Maitreya Bodhisattva's questions, Shakyamuni Buddha explains that Buddhahood, in fact, the true reality of all things, is unborn and deathless, and beyond the categories of self and other. I now bring this second of an 8-part presentation on the duration of the life of the Tathagata chapter of the Lotus Sutra to a close. I look forward to your questions and comments. May the merits of this talk on the Dharma extend universally to all, so that we and all living beings together accomplish the Buddha way.